Hello and welcome to this new series of workshops where we will talk about Azure management from a fundamentals perspective, focus heavily on demonstrations that you can use and apply in your business as usual and daily basis. My name is Arturo Hamilton and I'll be with you during this type of sessions. The first one we have ahead of us is the management of Azure identities and governance, so please sit back and enjoy the ride with us. The first lesson we're going to cover today is about working with Active Directory objects in Azure. The first key that you will notice here is that we're talking about Azure Active Directory. So that's the cloud counterpart of the objects that we have used up to this point in Active Directory domain services. Let's see what we have in here. The first topic that we're going to cover here is the management of Active Directory users and Active Directory groups. As you can see on this diagram, if we take a look to the left, we have on-premise applications, right? That's something we have had for the last 30, 35 years. Well, if we take a look to the right, we have a cloud diagram where we have Office 365, we have Azure, we have Dynamics, we have CRM, we have Microsoft Intune. Well, guess what? Using authorization and authentication from both ends, we can make them work together. Remember, authentication and authorization will happen in both ends. But guess what? On-prem, we have the traditional one, the usage of Kerberos, the usage of traditional Windows authentication, Windows Forms, Windows services, the usage of NTLM and LDAP as a protocol to communicate. While when we're working with cloud, we have OAuth, we have OpenID, we have Windows Federation, we have SAML tokens. This means that we can use Facebook, Twitter, we can use Google, to authenticate in Azure. And that's not all. From the other hand, we can create tokens based on SAML directly from the Azure Active Directory to authenticate into third-party technologies, like other cloud providers, like Facebook, like Twitter. This combination will give us the best of both to control and optimize the way we work on daily basis. Okay? This is to understand one and the other. But there's also something really important to remember. We can have authentication without authorization, but we cannot have authorization without authentication. Think about this example. You're about to board a flight. You get to the front end and the clerk asks for your papers, right? It's like, Mister, can you show me please your passport and your boarding pass? You go and show it. The person will look at it, will scan it, and will say, okay, it's a valid passport, it's a valid boarding pass, but guess what? You got an oversold ticket on the flight. So you'll have to wait for a no-show, for a cancellation, for a spare seat. You have been authenticated without being authorized. But before we move forward, before we start with the demonstrations we mentioned at the beginning of this session, my friends, why don't we define a couple of concepts? It's important to have the knowledge and the theory, right? So let's take a look on some of the Azure Active Directory concepts. First of all, the identity object. We all have heard about identities, right? Well, what about them? The identity, my friends, is an object that we can use to get authenticated, to get an authorization, and that can be attached to a user, to a service, to a system, to a business process. The idea of an identity is to have something to tag and identify, as the name suggests, right? Well, the object that we need. We have the accounts, an identity that has an actual piece of information associated, for example, an email account. How do I contact that identity? How do I determine the way of getting in touch with that identity? Well, via account. In Azure Active Directory, my friends, we have the option of creating AD accounts. The identity is offered directly by the Azure AD by a third-party provider, for example, Outlook, for example, a Hotmail account in Outlook, or a Microsoft 365 service. If you go into Office 365 and Microsoft 365 and create a user, the Azure AD account will be created. For Azure AD, we need a subscription. The subscription is the way we will use to interact with the Azure platform and the Microsoft service. There are a lot of different types of subscriptions. We will talk about that later today. Well, the idea of the subscription is that we have something that we can use to pay for the service or services I'm consuming. And finally, Azure Active Directory is multi-tenant by nature. We have Azure tenants and Azure directories. It's a way of having an isolated instance that we can dedicate and trust for the Azure Active Directory to limit the permissions, authentication, and authorization processes. These are a list of concepts that we can consider. But let's talk about the benefits. In Azure Active Directory, folks, we have a lot of benefits given by the cloud providing solution. As I was mentioning, we have OAuth, we have OpenID, so we can actually use this type of authentication to trust and be trusted by any other cloud provider identity. We have a benefit called single sign-on. You may have heard about this one, right? Well, you have the option of using this type of token that you created to authenticate into Azure, to authenticate now into another cloud provider, to authenticate into an on-prem app, to authenticate into a third-party service, for example, Facebook, for example, Dropbox. The idea is that you use the same token that Azure uses to authenticate now to go and without presenting a password, being authorized to use that new platform. It's compatible with any type of platform service. We can use iOS, we can use Mac, we can use Android. There are no limits in here. We can use this, for example, as a perimeter solution. You have applications on-prem that will be exposed via Azure, and Azure Active Directory will work for authentication. So the access is protected via a global endpoint of Azure, and then it's filtered to say yes or no to the on-prem. Active Directory domain services as we know it, it's now natively supported by Azure. That means that we can have a hybrid solution integrated as fast as we need it. We will talk about security, we will talk about protection, but just to give you an idea, a little bit of a spoiler in here, we can protect sensitive and private data directly in the Azure Active Service. And finally, remember, well, since we have a lot of options to self-service our users, and I'll show you a couple of these in the next minutes, we can reduce a lot of cost and the overhead of management. Think about your users being capable of resetting their passwords. Imagine the option for the users to ask for their own roles. Well, all that can be helped to reduce how we actually manage the on-prem solution. That's the idea of Azure Active Directory, folks. But important, there are multiple editions that we will have to include on the plan. When we talk about editions, folks, we're talking about different levels of licensing that we can acquire to get some features that we don't have on the basic options. For example, important, for free, we can have an Active Directory tenant limit to 500,000 objects without limitations on single sign-on and with the basic management of identity and collaboration. Would you like to use, for example, Microsoft 365 application and management? You have Azure Active Directory 365 applications. And then you have the premium features. Would you like to use self-service password reset? Would you like to have the benefit of creating conditions to say you can authenticate here but not in here? Would you like to have a self-service portal where the users can elevate their own roles? Well, all these are premium features. I'm going to show you these features. I'm going to show you how they work. The idea here is to have an understanding of the different models of licensing. To administrate our users, my friends, we have to understand that there are different types of identities. We can have cloud identities only created in Azure Active Directory. We can have, for example, hybrid identities created on-prem but now synchronized via AD Connect. We can have, for example, guest users. You won't let me lie. In the past, if you wanted to have a service from a consulting company, maybe they will send a consultant to your building, to your offices, and that person will be working with you for a couple of months, for a year. But guess what? That person will require an access. What will have you done back then? You will have created a user, a password in your domain, and give that to him or to her. That was 10 years ago. Nowadays, you can go and invite another directory. You can invite a Hotmail account. You can invite a Gmail account. If the user or the users have their own Active Directory tenant, you can trust that tenant, create a business to business, and have a guest. You don't have to create users anymore. I mean, for the guest. You have the chance now of inviting them and let them work on your directory whenever you need them. This is the idea of using guests. These are the types of identities we have. But we're going to talk about how to create them. To create them, you have to be a global admin, you have to be a security admin, or you have to be a user administrator. You need an elevated permission to create users. You need to have the information you want. I mean, you can create a user without a profile, but guess what? If you don't actually go for profile information, the only thing you'll have will be a name and an account. Is that useful? If the answer is yes, then proceed, my friend. but you have the option of doing so. Whenever you delete a user, you will have the chance of recovering for the next 30 days. But guess what? You don't have to delete the user. What if the user quits? What if the user gets fired? Let's be dramatic here. What if the user gets fired, right? Well, in that scenario, you have the option of blocking the sign-in. Instead of actually deleting the user and running the time of 30 days, why don't you block the sign-in, recover the information, get the accesses you need, and after you're pretty sure that the process is complete, then you proceed to delete. All these things that I've mentioned, all these options that we have, can be monitored from the logs. We're getting ready for the demonstrations. Are you excited? A couple of slides and I promise we'll be there. Well, let's be honest. I said a couple of slides, but we only have a screenshot of the process. Now we're actually gonna see how to use this directly in Azure. So come with me. Let's go into the Azure portal and see for the first time the Active Directory and the creation of a user. So that being mentioned, let's get into our portal. Welcome to the Azure portal. The first time you get into the portal, you will have this notification saying to take a tour. It's recommended that if you haven't used the portal in the past, well, take the time to go around the options, okay? In this case, we're talking about identities, my friends, so we're gonna get into identities. Before that, let me click here maybe later, and configure the portal. You can see here commonly used services, the navigation, some of the tools around, but guess what? We can configure the look and feel to make it suitable for the things that we like. For example, this is a personal decision, okay? I'm gonna go here, grab my settings, put on the left the usage of the commonly accessed services. You can see here a list of favorites. And I'm gonna go for something a little less bluish. I like something with a little bit of contrast. So I'm gonna use this configuration. You can modify at any moment, okay? You can see some navigation options. You can see on the top we have the Cloud Shell. We have the monitor of the tenant. In here you can see the Active Directory we're using, right? We have the notifications panel. Anything that happens will be shown in here. Some help and the feedback. So this is the starting point of our portal. Now, from here, we're going to take a look to the left, and if you scroll down a little bit, you'll find a pretty large pyramid. This is the Azure Active Directory. I think there is maybe a meaning about using a pyramid, right? Everything we have will rest on the base of the directory. That's how I like to interpret this icon. So let's take a look. We're going to create users, right? We have, as you can see here, a lot of different options to be used. We have a navigation panel. We have a list of best practices to get started. We can navigate around the videos, the demonstrations, the white papers, the step-by-step guides, okay? Now, if you take a look around and we go and focus on the left, you'll see a list of the favorite services, the services we may be using. This is determined by default when you create a subscription for the first time. Nevertheless, you can add your own services, okay? For example, if you are a lot into, I don't know, let's check what we have. All services. And by any means, you have a lot of needs based on, let's click on storage and see what we have in here. Store simple. We're going to talk about some of these subjects, but what if this is actually needed for me? Well, I can go and say favorite. I have something that we will use later. The policies. No, policy, sorry. And all. Let's filter again. Policy. There it is. This is something we're going to use today, and I think it's important to have it. So you can click favorite. You can see it's now all the way down to the bottom. I can drag this maybe a little bit, put it somewhere different, or just move it around wherever you want it, maybe in here, and we're good. That's just for you to customize this experience. Now, look for the pyramid. There is a meaning behind this icon, I think. Okay, I'm guessing here, but I think based on a pyramid, we can build a complete solution, a pretty huge base where we will build the Microsoft solution we need. So this, my friends, is the Azure Active Directory. Once in here, you have an overview. You can see the role you have as a user, the type of license that you have. We can, for example, here and say, I need something premium. I can go and activate a premium tier. Check this. If I go all the way down and try to access password reset, for example, you can see I need a premium trial. I'm going to click here. activate a premium trial just in order to test the services we need today. And I'm going to click activate. You can see the notifications panel now. It's saying we're activated. And in the next minutes, we'll actually have the access to the password reset. We'll be back later. Okay? Now, the first thing that we had, if you remember the last slide we were watching, it's about creating users. We're going to go here and create our users. You have all your users. The default administrator you created, this is the account you used to register. And now on the top, you can see we have new users. I'm going to click in here and you see create a new user. If I click on invite, it's the same as if I click on new guest. Okay, you can see it's the same. Actually, the experience will be the same. We just change a cloud identity or an invite identity. Let's create a user. We're going to call this user, for example, let's call this guy John Doe. We're going to go here and say John Doe. The only two mandatory attributes you need to create a user, folks, is the username and the name. As you can see on the red stars of the names, right? John Doe. You can see here, it's required. All the other options are optional. Well, being redundant, right? All the other attributes, let's correct, are optional. Well, in this case, we're going to fulfill everything so we can have as much information as possible. We have now, sorry, I was clicking there a different letter. We have now last name and first name. We can assign a password here, or we can auto-generate a password. By default, when the user is created, we'll be asked to reset the password. That's actually a nice practice, okay? So let's try to stick to that. I'm gonna let it like this. I don't need to see the password right now. We'll use this maybe later. So if we don't have groups, we can create the user as without a group. Later today, we can add a group, we can add this user to the group, and then use the membership for something else. There is a beta version, for example, where you can assign a role to the group, and then that will be inherited by the user. Well, we can do that. I'm gonna go here to roles, and say this user can be my security admin, my global admin. You can see here all the roles. We'll talk about this a little bit in detail later today. But the idea is what type of user we have. By default, my friends, every time we create a user, a standard user account will be generated. No advanced permissions, no advanced roles. Remember what I was saying about blocking the sign-in? Think about this scenario. You get a call from human resources and they say, Arturo, please, I need you to create a user. We got a new hiring process running and this person will be here. John will be here in 2 weeks. Well, those 2 weeks will be for him to prepare, to take the training, to know about the company, right? In the meantime, I can block him. This user will be created, activated, but not able to log. This is important for a security scope. Okay, not mandatory, but a nice to have. The location. Our subscription might be created in the United States, but what if this user is going to connect from the United Kingdom, right? Well, in order to have processes running on their local time, or maybe to have a little bit of an improved connection, giving him the access to the closest edge point of Azure, well, we need to be clear about where the user is located. And then we can add some information in here. I can go here and say he will be a computer administrator, admin. He's part of service delivery. And it's part of our company called Contosa. If we had more users, I could give him an admin. We only have our top level Arturo administrator, right? The Microsoft account. So in this case, I don't have a manager yet. For the next user we create, we can start playing around with the managers. So as you can see, our user is ready. Let's create another one. Let's do it a little bit faster now that we know the things expected. We're going to create Jane Doe. Since we already have used the J, we're going to have JA.DOE. So she will be our second user. Jane Doe. Jane Doe. Someone will think they are brothers, right? We can have the same password, same roles, authorized. She will be in the United States. She will be, for example, service delivery manager. She is in service delivery. She's part of Contoso. And now that we have two users, I can go back to John. And if Jenny is the manager, guess what? Well, John will have now a direct manager. In here, you can see now the user is created. Okay? You can see my server is being throttlered. That means that we're having the services in a queue. Well, we have now the user. You can see here the source is Azure Active Directory. I'm going to invite a guest, so you'll see a different option. I can go down, you can see he's blocked. I can add some extra information as contact that we didn't have at the beginning. I can click on edit, and I can go here and say, I'm going to have a change one. I'm going to select Jane, and she will be John's manager. This is the fundamental process to create a user. Now that we have our user, what if you need to create someone or you need to create a group of users in a row? You will say, hey, am I supposed to do this 100 times? If you have to create 5, it's fine, right? But what if you have to create 100, 1,000 users that you might have had in a different location? Well, we have the chance, whenever we need, of performing bulk operations. We can use PowerShell or we can use a CSV file. This option, for example, of a CSV file can be done directly via the GUI, the interface. Let's take a look here. We go back to the portal. Here we are. We go back to users. And on the top next to the guest, you can see bulk operations. Bulk create, bulk invite. If I click on bulk create, I can download the template to see what we have. Let's use this template. It's opening here. And you can see here my template. So I can go and say, let's create Chris Green. The thing that we have here, folks, keep in mind, is that we need a valid domain. Contoso.com is an example. But my actual domain, as you can see here, is msftjumpseries.onmicrosoft.com. We can confirm that, just a little bit of a sneak peek. We can go back to the Active Directory. We can look in here, we can look in here for the actual certificates. Take a look on the orange certificate, that's the domain, and this is the domain you're using. So I'm going to use this one. We're going to create Chris. Let's create here Chris. And Chris will be C Green, right? Now, let's add someone else. We're going to add here, let me just remove the name. And let's add here, you can see the other attributes, Chris and Green. We can add the other options that we had. Remember, all those are no mandatory things. We can go here and say now, for example, we can create Sana Liu as Liu at and our domain. We can use the same password, no block sign in, Sana and Liu. I can go here and add, for example, let's say Marine Waterford, M Waterford at domain. I think I copied the password, remember? So let me just copy here my domain so we can have this on our demo. There we are. Password. And let's say no. Let's go for Marine. And let's go for Waterford. There we have her. So we can add this from any source that we need. So it's ready, right? Let's save it. Once this is saved, we can upload that same file that we had now into my user creation. Remember, users, bulk operations, and bulk create. Let's grab the file. It should be on my downloads if we actually got it. You can see here user create template. You can see successfully uploaded. Let's submit. It's going to analyze if there is an error, if something is missing, if one of the mandatory attributes is not there, if the domain is wrong. Remember, I changed the domain. So this might take a while, okay? We will wait here a couple of seconds while it's completely analyzed. I mean, when you go for 100 or 1,000 object creation, you might have to wait maybe 10 minutes, 20 minutes. You can see we have an error. Let's check here, and you can see here, detailed information. What's happening with my operation? We can go here, and you can see here the username in the uploaded content. I wanted to show you this. You can see the name seems to be failing. What's the issue? The object ID is not registered. This was on purpose. The idea is that you actually have the option of checking what was wrong. You can download a report. You can open the report. Okay, this is our original demo. And you can see here the whole thing that you have. Change the username to be something valid. Okay, as you can see, and if we take a look, we have an actual error in there because it's not been recognized given the empty space that we had. Okay, that's the objective of this part. So let's go back. Let me delete this. Let me save this. Sorry, save it. There we are. Let's go back here to our Active Directory and let's do it again. Azure Active Directory, users, bulk creation, and you can see Marine and Sana are already there. You see? Even though it failed, we have an error. What do you think is going to happen now? If we upload now, the one we have, that was this one, it's going to fail because Sana and Marine are now created. I wanted you to see how you can troubleshoot the bulk creation. Now that we have our users and we have created a couple of bulk processes on the demonstration, how do we create a guest? Or what's the purpose of creating a guest, right? Let me show you here. The idea of a guest, folks, for example, it's to invite someone external to my directory to collaborate. There are scenarios where you may want to create a full administrator. I mean, it's not recommended, but you can do that. Once the external vendor, once the third-party provider is actually registered, we don't have to give him or give her a new account. The one that he already has or that she already has is valid to be used. So that's the idea of using the guests. Okay, how do we do that? As we were saying, we go here, we click on new guest, and we're gonna send an invitation. So the name will be Arturo Hamilton, that's myself. I'm gonna go here and say use his personal account. There we go. Arturo and Hamilton. Personal message. Hi Arturo. You are invited to collaborate with our company. Regards, Contoso admin. This is quite recommended, okay? Try to be polite, try to get an invitation that is meaningful. I have received invitations in the past where I don't know where it's coming from and you are like, okay, I don't know what's happening here. And then check this, groups and roles, sign in, location, we can go here to United States, title, we can say external vendor, department, service delivery, company name, we can call this, for example, Fabrichem. That's going to be Arturo's account. And I can assign Jane, given that she's our manager, as Arturo's manager. Everything looks good. We're good to go. We click invite. The invitation will be sent. You can see it's now a guest. And you can see invitation sent, company name. I can open the new guest we created, and you'll see on the source that is invited, and I can resend the invitation. So we have received the invitation. Let's take a look here. There it is. You can see from the directory, this is the domain, the message, hi Arturo, you are invited. Sent by whom? Well, the administrator. If you click accept, a new page will be loaded where we will have the actual authentication. You can see here, it's now loaded with this account into this directory. I'm going to click accept. This is the experience of a guest. And now I'll be part of the domain. Once the domain is complete, we can go back to the portal. And in a couple of minutes, we will see now that it changed from Microsoft account and replaced the invite user. If you invite someone from an external Active Directory, you will see in here the source as external Azure Active Directory. So that way you can actually filter and control where the users are coming from. Now it's time to talk about the groups, okay? As we were mentioning before, we're gonna use the groups to create allocations and commonalities between my users. If we go back here just for a second, we have two types of groups in Azure. We have security groups to control access, authentication, and authorization, and 365 groups that we can use in Microsoft 365, as the name suggests, so the users can have access, for example, to SharePoint, to Exchange, to Teams, to calendars, to Jammer, to collaboration tools like Planner, like Power Apps, Power Automate, etc. We can create them both directly from the directory. Okay, we have a central control in here. Let's take a look here. Let's go back to the portal. We're in groups. I'm going to click here, add a membership. You can see I don't have anything yet, right? I need to create a group now. We're going to start in here by adding a complete new group to my service. Let's see here. So since we don't have a group ready, my user, my guest, cannot be added. Let's go back to the directory then. We're going to click now under management on the groups. In here, we're going to actually use the creation of a new group from scratch. New group. Check the difference. We have security and 365. On security, we can have the name, description, owners, and members. Under 365, we can add an account. Remember the definition of account we explained earlier today. We can add the description. And guess what? I can add, if I need to, some labels, some security, some membership. So let's start with a security one. This will be called security secured users. Let's use something meaningful. This is a group to control the access of my users. There. The owner will be, let's give this to the admin. We have our admin here. And the members will be, you can see I have system identities too, right? I'm going to add my guest. I'm going to add here the two newly created users, Sana and Marin. Let's add also John. Let's keep scrolling. If we have computers, if we had virtual machines, services, networks, we can use all those. No, this is already the admin. Let's remove him. And we can add here Sana. There. We click select and we click create. Easy peasy, we have a group. We can create a Microsoft 365 now. Let's go here. Let's call this Microsoft 365 group, M365 group. This group is for users who will be part of SharePoint. For example, if we're planning to use a SharePoint site. And the same, I can add an owner. We can go back to our administrator. And here I can go and say, you can see I only have users now. User identities, not system identities. That's because these users will be able to work with Teams, with SharePoint, with Exchange, etc. So I can add them all, including the admin, so all of them can be part of my SharePoint, for example. We click create, and now we have, well, now we have two groups. So now that we have the groups, folks, let's take a look on what can we do to start providing that reduction of responsibilities we talk about, right? There is a solution in Azure where you can give to the users the option of resetting their own passwords. Just to keep it simple, that's what we can do. We're going to look for the golden key icon. That sounds like a movie plot. Go to the directory and look for the golden key. Here is the password reset. So once we have it, we'll click on it and we'll be able to use the self-service password reset. If you find SSPR as an acronym, it's a reference to this specific feature. So by default, no one can change their passwords. That's the first thing. You can select specific groups, not users. Remember, that is pretty important. You can select a group or everyone in your organization. Remember we created a security group earlier today? Well, a few minutes ago. Let's go here and grab my secure users. Only those users on the group will be able to change their password. Now, that's not all. Now that they are authorized to change their password in cloud, we're going to go here and ask them for a couple of things. I'm going to ask you for two methods. I'm going to send you a mail, a mobile phone once you register your mobile as a user, and I'm going to ask you 4 questions. Let's go for 4, and you have to have 3 of them defined. We can go here and say, pretty fine, city, last name of your favorite teacher in high school. I hope you remember, my friends, because I don't. I remember the guy, I remember the name, but I don't remember the last name. And for example, what was the name of the hospital in which you were born? I don't know that answer. We have 3. I'm going to add a custom one, so at least we have some variety. And well, let's go for something a little bit more complex, right? What is the best cloud service? There. Add it. Who knows the answer? Well, we'll see. We click OK, and we click OK. We save this, and now if the users want to change their passwords, the users on the security group, secure users, will have to go for 2 out of those 3 methods, receiving and receiving maybe a code, an SMS, or answering their questions. This is the option of self-service password reset, and this completes our first lesson of the day. Okay, we have complete here self-service password reset. This is what we were saying. Why will you use this? So give you some theory. Just keep in mind that you will reduce the management, the overhead of management. The help desk department will have to the chance of focusing, if you will, in something more important or something like maybe relevant, while the users have now a self-service solution to keep their passwords protected. Okay? Thank you very much for taking this first lesson with us. We'll see you back on the lesson number 2. So let's get into the next lesson and let's talk about role-based access control, or the old RBAC that we all have heard about. Role-based access control, my friends, it can be considered a principle, it can be considered a best practice, it can be considered an approach, whatever you prefer to call it. It's actually a solution that we will use to customize the way we authorize the access to our services. As simple as that. You have a user that will have specific roles and attributes given by the rights over a service. Easy peasy. You have, for example, a principle of requirement to work with a storage, to work with a computer. There is no need for you to give management over all the computers, right? You can go to the storage, you can go to the specific computer and assign the role control. Assign the rights needed for that user to work on that specific computer without doing anything else. User, role, and rights. A principle, a pretty important principle on the role-based access control. When we start talking about the authentication process, well, it's important we remember that inheritance will always be the case. As you can see on this slide, we start on the top. We start on the management group. We will talk about this in detail in the next topics. But if we assign the role to a parent object, like a subscription, like the tenant, like the management group, that one will inherit by the next level, and the next level. It's important that we remember that when we assign a role directly based on RBAC, the inheritance cannot be broken directly in Azure. Okay, so let's try to scope this over the actual service that we want to use. The computer or the resource group, the resource group or the subscription or the subscriptions in the management group. That way the authentication will be successfully achieved in the service, in the object, in the target that we want it to have. But let's see the concepts. We have a security principle. The security principle is something that is trying to work over a service. It can be a user, it can be a system account, it can be an identity base on a service. The role definition is the permission or permissions that the security principle can perform over the scope. And the scope, it's the actual level that we're giving to the access request. For example, A reader has a scope of reading permissions. It's a role definition of reader with a scope created so the access cannot go beyond the reading options. And finally, the assignments is the target. The role definition to a security principal to a particular scope using that target to be what we have to do. This is like the definition of RBAC. I'm going to show you this in a minute, and it will be easier for you to catch in the understanding, to grasp to the concept, but it's just to have the theory behind it. Okay? A pretty important successful rate of this is to set the appropriate roles. It's always relevant for us to remember that there are a lot of different things that can be done. For example, remember what I said a few minutes ago. We have a user that will control the storage, right? Well, that storage account has to be controlled, not monitored, not reported. To control, we need reading and writing permissions, right? So from the list in here, you might go and say contributor. Now, the user does not require to give other users permission, right? That's an owner. So even though both contributor and owner have the exact same level of permissions over the service, the other accesses given by it can only be achieved with an ownership, not with a contributor account. That's why it's so important, because we will always have to provide the limits that we need based on the type of permissions, based on the type of activities that can be done by one of these users. Okay? That's our scope on this specific topic. After we set the roles according to our needs and the way we want to use them, there is something important to keep in mind: the differences between Azure RBAC roles and Azure Active Directory roles. These are not the same. A role-based access control role will give you the access over the resource, okay, the computer, the storage, the resource group, the subscription. The scope can be assigned, as I was mentioning, from top to bottom, always following the inheritance. The role information can be modified by the portal, by CLI, by PowerShell, by a resource manager, by a third-party app. While the roles that we have in Azure, not the RBAC, the roles are actually managed based on the permissions from the Azure Active Directory. This is at tenant level. This means that if I give you a role of computer administration on the role-based access control, the computer or resources mapped will be affected by it. But if I go to the Azure Active Directory and give you the VM manager role or the VM admin role, all the virtual machines on the tenant, and that includes maybe multiple subscriptions, multiple groups, multiple users, multiple objects, will be affected by it. That's the key difference. You have a specific target and you have a global scope of a tenant. That's the difference between them both. Okay? But enough talk. Let's take a look on the roles. I'm going to show you a couple of things here before we get into the actual RBAC. Let's go to our portal. We were on the password reset. So let's go back and start from the home again. Before we get into the role-based access control, let's take a look on the actual Active Directory roles. Remember, we just talked about the difference? Well, Azure Active Directory, remember the pyramid? And look for the green guy. Roles and administrators. We're going to click in here, and we have a list of given roles for Azure. These are at tenant level. You can see where you are, and you can see the different roles available. For example, if you want to check what the global admin can do, we can open it. We can go to the description and check this. We have a summary of the things that can be done and all the tasks that can be performed, including the scope. You can see here a lot of things, right? If I go, for example, back to the directory and I select the directory reader, check the difference. Well, we don't have that many things in here. The idea here is to understand the limitations and permissions of each to determine if that's what we need, if that's what we want to use. If you're not sure about the users who are in a role, just click on the assignments and you'll be able to see who has been assigned to that role. We can confirm that by clicking on Global Admin, Assignments, and you can see our administrator account of the subscription. These are the Azure roles, okay? With premium subscriptions, with premium 1 and premium 2, you have the chance of adding custom roles, grabbing specific objects from the permissions, putting them there with a name, and then assign it to a custom scope. These are the directory roles. Now, what is the role-based access control roles? Let's take a look. So to check the role-based access control, folks, we're going to go here into a storage account that we had prepared for this demonstration. Don't worry, when we get into the storage account discussions, we'll explain how to get there. In this case, let's go to our storage account. Let's put this scenario as an idea to understand what we're doing. Someone got hired to administrate my storage. That person will be responsible of the file shares, of the blob shares, of the queues, of the tables, the security, the encryption, the legal holds, etc. That's the purpose of that person from being in my company. Okay? You can see we have something called access control, identity access manager within the parentheses. This is where the roles are assigned as role-based access control, not as a directory role. Let's check. I'm going to go here. I'm going to click on role assignments. And you can see this storage account has no actual assignments, right? Okay. I'm going to click on add a role assignment. And we're going to go here and say, for example, John was hired to protect my storage account. Remember the different type of permissions we have? Well, take a look in here. Owner, contributor, and reader. And then something really important here, my friends. Every time you assign a role base into a service, you will notice owner, contributor, reader, access manager, and then different type of permissions. If you go to a virtual machine, you'll see operating system, you'll see diagnostics. If you go to a key vault, you'll see certificates, you'll see encryption, you'll see secrets. In here, for example, you can see our operator, backup operator, you can see site recovery contributor if we use a storage account as a site recovery vault, monitoring reader, etc. Remember, if I give ownership to John, John will be able to assign other admins. I'm going to give contributor for the things that John is supposed to do: backup, security, encryption, availability, resiliency. This is enough. I click save, and we have a role now. Well, now we have a role. You can see assigned to this scope. Now, Jane, if you remember, according to our definition, is John's manager. So she needs access not only to the storage, but all the services on the service delivery group, right? Let's go to that service delivery group. We're going to go here to our resource group. On the resource group, you have the location where the storage account is created. You can see here is my storage account. And the same, access control, but now at resource group level. Let's check the roles. I don't have any roles on the resource group. We're on the next level of hierarchy. I'm going to click add a role. And here, we're going to have an ownership for Jane. We have Jane in here and save. Even better, what if our guest, let's say Arturo, it's supposed to be like an internal auditor that will take care of the logs, right, of the transactions. We can go to the next level of management. In this case, that next level is the subscription. We're going to go here to all services and subscriptions. Yes, there it is. Subscriptions. Role-based access control. Select the subscription where you have the resource group. And the same. Access control. In here, we already have an owner. That it's my account because that was created on the top. It's not shown in here, but it's already available. I can add another role in here. I can go and say, for example, owner. Let's grab someone else. Let's say Sana. We click save, and that's now scoping the subscription in here. Let me show you what we get from it. Storage account. The one that we created first. Access control. And now see the magic in here. Role assignments. John is on the resource. Jane is inherited by the resource group. And Sana is inherited by the subscription all the way to the top. So we have now a complete waterfall of roles. Remember what I said. There is no option to break down the inheritance right now. Okay? Sana will have ownership over the resource groups of the subscription and the objects within there. Jane only on her resource group and John only on my storage account. That, my friends, is the usage of role-based access control. So to wrap up this second lesson of the day, folks, we're going to go back to our slides for a second. We complete the role-based access control, and we're going to talk about the directories. Just to wrap it up. As I said at the beginning of this module, my friends, we have the chance of creating multiple directories, right? You can offer to your users, to your customers, to whoever is managing this, the option of a multi-tenant solution, multiple directories. Each tenant that you create will be completely independent from the others, and the resources within it will be isolated and limited by the boundary of that tenant, by that directory. Okay, this is useful, for example, if you are handling multiple accounts. Let's say that you are a service provider and your actual business is to offer directory management to your customers. Well, you'll create something for contoso.com, something for fabricam.com, something for adatum.com, something for company.com. All of them isolated from each other. They won't be able to see the content of the other. They won't be able to consume the content from the others. It will always be directly and isolated. That's the idea of multiple directories. If we go back to the Azure Active Directory here just for a demo, remember we have a tenant. I can go to the marketplace, Azure Active Directory, and instead of clicking on the service, on the marketplace you can see I have the option of getting a second one. I can click in here with the same admin account. I can go and call this, for example, Contoso Jump Series, and let's use that as the domain name. This will be in the United Kingdom, for example. We click create and we have a second tenant. Myself as the admin, and we will see that, my MSFT jump series at outlook.com user is now creating a secondary tenant where this user or this account will have permissions. But the things that we saw up to this point about roles, users, groups, accesses, the storage account are no longer a thing. At least not in this tenant. They still exist on the other one, on the previous one. But now on the new one that it's being deployed in here, we don't have like that specific type of listed objects that we already had because this is independent, isolated, and limit from the other. So it's gonna take here maybe a couple of minutes. We'll have it ready. And once the tenant is complete, I'll be able to click in here and check my different directories. You can see current directory. It's the tenant we have by default where we created the users, right? Once the tenant is ready, I'll be able to switch between directories and create a complete different type of granulation. There it is. This is the principle of the multi-tenancy, folks. In the next minutes, I'll be able to see in here the second tenant. You can see I can click there to manage my tenant. It's opening now. You can see it's different again. We have a directory. We have everything new from scratch. The user, as I said, is the same. The difference is that I'm using a different directory with a different tenant. Think about multi-divisional organizations. Think about worldwide coverage with granulated geography. These are approaches of the multi-tenant, folks. I can click back in here, and now you can see I have the standard one and the new one we created above that. We're back on our tenant. Just to confirm, we have our users in here, and we're good to go. This is the principle of a multi-tenant approach using Azure Active Directory. Now it's time to talk about subscriptions and governance, my friends. We're going to talk about the management, the administration of subscriptions, this little object that we use to interact with the platform. How does Microsoft gives me the chance of consuming their services? How do I get access, for example, to create a virtual machine, to create a storage account, right? Well, all that is given by the subscriptions. That's what we're going to discuss now. The first thing is to define a subscription. An Azure subscription, folks, as I was mentioning before when we talked about the concepts at the beginning of this lesson, it's a way of interacting. It's a way of creating a single unit of access where you will be able to consume and interact with the services offered by Microsoft. An Azure account is given to that subscription. The services will be provided based on that subscription. And as we have been saying, you can create multiple subscriptions, multiple tenants, and granulate based on security, services, and accesses. Every single cloud service that we have in Azure will be given to this subscription. So in case, for example, you need to have a consumption report, in case you have to add a new payment method for a new service, in case you have to create a budget control service, all this, it's a subscription level. As we were seeing when we assign the role-based access control, we can do that directly from the golden key. I love to say golden key, as you can see. And there, from there, actually get the service working on the front end. This is a definition for a subscription. But guess what? The subscription is one of the units that we're talking about, a logic unit, that can be used to create a group of them and provide something called a management group. A management group can be summarized as a group of subscriptions. Okay, that's a little bit rough, but it's like the fundamental understanding. Now, what actually can be done by a management group? Think about this scenario. You are on the IT department. Okay, you have a service delivery team under your responsibility. You have a unit specialized in Azure subscriptions. Now, you as the admin or you as the manager will take care of all the different subscriptions, or you will have visibility over all of them to check for compliance, to check for cost, to check for management. Well, on the top of the hierarchy of the management group, you'll create something called, for example, Service Delivery Management Group, and you have all the subscriptions there. What if you have a single user in your team specialized for marketing subscriptions? A single user for Power BI, reporting, management of informations, data intelligence. A single user for corporate affairs, communications. You can create management group with each of those division subscriptions for these users to have access only to that. Think about the management group as a way of isolating the scope of access to a subscription level. You can have subscriptions for dev, for test, for production. And you can have the three of them in one management group. So we're talking about now a top level management group and inherit management groups. That way you can have a granulation of access. That's the objective of using a management group in Azure. How do we do that? Well, we can create management groups directly from the portal. I'm going to show you this in a second. The idea is to obviously add the services that you want to use and display a name that you'll use to control. Let's take a look. We go here, we search for management groups. You can see there are management groups on the top. I click start using management groups. We're going to create a new one. This will be top management group. And we can call this main, for example. This will be like on my example, the one given to the global admin or the one given to the service delivery admin. The management group is added like that. The subscriptions are inherit and we're good to use it. While we wait here, let's take a look of an example. Remember what I was mentioning? The user who has access to the top one on this diagram will inherit that access to all the others. And then you can granulate. For example, the one with the two subscriptions will be the one of marketing. One single person will have administration over it. That's a dedicated specialist, for example. One for BI, management of information, and one for the corporate affairs and communications. You can granulate on different levels. And remember the role-based access control. If I assign permissions on the top, that will inherit up to the service level, as we did and as we saw with the storage account. So you may be thinking, okay, this looks amazing. I have management groups and I have a lot of options, but what about the subscriptions? Where do I get one, right? How do I get an actual subscription to be used? Well, there are a lot of options. There are a lot of scenarios where you can get subscriptions. For example, you can go and say, I need to have A full support subscription by Microsoft. With premium support, I need to have the best SLA. I need to have a specialist of second and third tier. I need to have everything available for my production environments. Well, you go and get an enterprise agreement. You commit yourself or the organization to have a minimal consumption. Let's say $1 million a year. You may pay in advance in some scenarios. You may have a special agreement, but the idea is that you say, I'm going to consume $1 million, and that's your enterprise agreement. You get all the services in here. You may get this from a reseller, an authorized reseller. Someone might be selling to you the option, and they may be managing the solution. This is an important part. For example, if you don't have the knowledge, the skills, the time from the reseller or the partner, also as an option, you may get some support. So they will take care, for example, of the users, the directory, the services, and you take care of the reports, the logs, and you are monitoring constantly what's happening with what you're paying for, right? And that's important. Well, you can also get a personal free account. For free, you can go and get a free account as long as you register your credit card. You won't be charged. You have a specific amount of money, $200, $100, depending on where and how you created it, and then you have the usage of some free services for 12 months, some tiers of computers, some tiers of storage, and you can use these to learn, to prepare, to use your own solutions. There are another scenarios for sponsorship accounts for training, MSDN accounts for customers, etc. But the idea here is to understand that there are multiple options to get it. If we go to the portal, check here, remember the subscriptions, I can click on my subscription and see what we have. I have my standard subscriptions and stuff. If I go to subscriptions, I can click on add and I'll have the options that we're talking about. I'll have the chance now of using my credit card for a free trial, of adding an enterprise agreement, etc. You can see here, based on the type of account I have, I am available to use. Not eligible for this one because I already have a sponsorship, but I can pay as I go. If I register a credit card, I'll pay for the services I consume per minute, per second, per hour, per month, depending on the billing period of each of them. I can get a sponsorship as a student. If this subscription I already have expires, I can add a credit card and transform it into pay as you go. What I'm trying to say here, folks, is that the subscriptions will vary based on our needs, based on the approach, and based on how we use it. Okay? I will highly recommend, folks, that you start with something maybe as a free trial, as a small pay as you go, for personal purposes, for small purposes, while the company, the organization will start maybe with something paid in advance. At the end of the day, the benefits are given by the support, are given by the SLAs. So we will have to be quite critical about what we need from this subscription. Okay? The relevance of it. Once we determine that, we will be quite capable of deciding the best solution to have a subscription in our service. Something really important to include in our plans are the regions. What is a region? Think about the region as a geographic location where a data center or data centers exist together to provide the service that we need. There are more than 60 regions available. We have enough coverage in the world to offer our service as close as possible to some of our customers. There are a lot of different regions. We have regions specialized for government. We have regions specialized for the China's government. We have regions, for example, using a special security based on the data centers they are located. There are undisclosed locations in the United States for government exclusive use regions. You can see on this small map, those white dot lines are announced regions that we don't have yet, but will be here in the future, in the next months or years. Microsoft is trying to offer a worldwide coverage. It's important we remember, each of these regions, folks, it's a combination of one or more data centers. Think about that as an independent compound. How do we know that we have a data center? Well, if the building or the floor of the building is isolated, it has its own power supply, cooling system, and network supply, it's considered a data center. There are regions, for example, East US, that will have more than one data center. And you will be able of using high availability, some redundancy across the different floors or different buildings with independent supplies. That's the idea of a region, folks. You can select most of them in any scenario. There are exceptions, as I said, government, China. It will be based on some conditions like the type of service, the type of product, the conditions of your organization. But 95% of the regions are available for anyone. The best practice is if you are managing, for example, in the United States, but your users will connect in the United Kingdom, why don't you go to UK West or why don't you go to UK South? You connect there, you read from there, while you, from the United States, control the actual management. The users will have an improved experience, and for you, the latency won't be that big of an issue because you are not working on business as usual on the actual resource, but on the management of it. These are the regions, folks. There are maps, there are objects that we can always follow to see the latest news, the available benchmark, the available backend pools, the available everything that we have here to work around our globe. Ideas of using our regions. And the region discussion brings me to the Azure accounts. An Azure account, folks, it's basically the usage of the subscription attachment that will be given to access to the platform. Remember, the subscription will give me the chance of interacting with the services. An Azure account is the identity in the directory that is trusted by that to use the subscription we created. For example, if we go to our directory, you can see the account I'm using is an Outlook account for these demonstrations, Microsoft Jump Series. That one is the one that is using the subscription we created for this specific series of events. So that's my account. That's how I use it. And that's a benefit we get because we can have, as you saw, the same account with different directories, right? The multi-tenant approach we discussed earlier today. Let's go back here and talk about a couple of extra things before we move into governance and we wrap up our session of the day. The first thing that we have to discuss in here is the usage of resources and subscriptions on the permission access. We already talked about this when we were mentioning roles, when we were mentioning accesses. Well, at subscription level, folks, we have to be sure that we have a one-to-one relationship because that's mandatory. Take a look on the third bullet point. Every subscription you create can trust a single directory. The tenant I created for the demo has no subscription right now. I will have to add a subscription to that tenant in order to use it. If the subscription expires, the services we have, the service principals, and everything we have granulated inside of the directory will be expiring. It will be into a frozen state standby mode. If we reactivate the subscription by adding credit, by adding a new payment method, by changing the type of subscription, this reactivates and we can use it again. But at the end of the day, we have to remember this relationship subscription to permissions. Okay? You can see here we have the portal, we have PowerShell, CLI, and REST clients. All of this to work via something called the ARM. You might be thinking, okay, that's new. We haven't talked about this yet. Well, that's true. Those of you who were curious in the past about the usage of Azure, think about 5 years ago, maybe, or maybe you read about it or something. You may remember, or if you had the chance of watching videos, or if you go right now and look for a video, you'll see that Azure in 2015 was completely different. The Azure portal, the classic portal now, it's a new name, right? It wasn't called like that back then, but now it's classic. Well, it was based on services, not on resources. That means that you had a service for all the virtual machines, a service for the networks, a service for the databases, and you will have to connect services between each other directly from an endpoint. It was based on different type of technologies, maybe a little bit out of date technologies nowadays. So that changed. What is a resource manager? We have been using that the whole day. This is the resource manager. The interactive layer of the portal that we use to create resources, to administrate services, to manage user accounts, permissions, roles, and all the things we have been doing today during the session are based on the resource manager. That's the ARM. If you find that acronym means Azure Resource Manager and it's the interactive layer we have. Don't get me wrong. I can connect to PowerShell, for example, and interact with the resource manager to create a service from a command line interface instead of a graphic user interface. At the end of the day, the result and the expected management of it will be the same, right? That's the objective of it. That's the idea of our Azure Resource Manager. And within, you can see here to the right of the diagram, we have an authentication scope. The authentication scope, as we have discussed, will be the process of asking for permission, sending a token, and then being authorized or denied to access and use the service or resource that we wanted. So how do we control this? How do we secure the usage of the resources via Resource Manager? Well, you might remember when I was showing you the portal for the first time, I decided to map as favorite the Azure policies. There was a reason behind that. The policy folks will help you to enforce baselines and standards. As easy as that. Advantages of it. You'll have compliance. You'll have governance over the services. You'll have standardization and baselines. You'll be able to remediate the service whenever it's needed. What's the idea of a policy, for example? You'll be able to use the policy in this case to create a standard baseline to say, hey, my friends, you cannot create out of the United States. You cannot name your services this or that. You cannot build computers based on this tier that it's a little bit expensive for the purposes of the organization. That's the objective of a policy. Real case scenarios in here, something that we can actually achieve with policies. Well, as I was mentioning, resource types. I'm only going to use Azure for storage and computers. I don't need anything else. I can add the resource type. And then the computers can only be this, and that SKU. I don't want to have a large expensive computer for something I can process with a medium or a small size computer. Think about sovereignty. If you are handling or managing customer private information, you wouldn't want your information to leave the country, right? Because it's supposed to be processed within the United States. Well, you can go and use this to limit the regions that can be used. If you remember the regions we discussed about, well, now you can limit that. You can require a tag and a value. I'll mention this in a couple of seconds. You can enable agents to be installed, agents to exist. These are the options of the policies, folks. The policies are driven by a definition. That sounds a little bit obvious and common sense, right? Well, we can build definitions in order to use the policies. But let's take a look. Enough theory in here. Let's go to the portal. From the portal, we're going to go to policy. You can see by default, well, we have compliance because we don't have policies, right? We're going to go to definitions under authoring here. You can see we have a list of definitions available that we can use. If the definition does not exist, for example, if you want to customize something that is based on the organization, like a combination of services or characteristics, you can create a complete new definition from scratch using JSON files. That's an option. But most of the times we may have the policy ready, or at least something quite close to what we need. So if I'm not going to use a definition that I'm going to customize, I can assign a pre-existing definition to protect or to standardize, as we said. Let's see. Under authoring, I'm going to click on assignments now. I'm going to add a new policy. I'm going to assign a policy. Here goes a question, a trick. What if I have 5 policies that I need for all my organizational requirements around the world? I need a definition called Contoso definition. That Contoso definition includes sizes, tiers, SKUs, regions, and tags. Well, there is something called initiatives, my friends. And the initiative, to keep it simple, is a group of policies. If you have 2 or 100 different policies to be part of it, you can use the initiative. Let's go back here. Let's start with a single policy. We're going to call this policy, you can see here, scope, subscription, and I can exclude resource groups. I only have 1. So I'm not going to create exclusions. If I have 2 and I want this policy region to apply only here, I'll do it from here. So there we are. Definition. Remember I explained that we have multiple definitions. I'm going to create one for location. Cosmos DB location, resource location. You can see here allowed locations. This is the one I have. The name will be allowed locations, United States. This policy, will limit the resource creation to the US regions. There. It's going to be enabled by me. I'm the user who's creating this. I'm going to go next and select the locations. If I select here US, you can see Central US, is US 2, North Central, South Central, West US, and West US 2, and the new one 3. There we are. I'm going to click next, and then we have remediation. This is an important part. There are policies that will only audit, like this one. Will show a non-compliant warning if the service was created before the policy was assigned. After the policy is created, the resources won't be allowed to be created out of the United States, okay? And we'll have to select something on the regions. If I select a policy, for example, to assure that all my computers have a backup agent installed, instead of audit if not exist, the policy will use something called deploy if not exist. You get the difference, right? Audit if not exist is show me a non-compliant, block the creation. Deploy if not exist is check all the things we already had and then install the agent if needed. In this case, this one cannot move the resources automatically. We have to go for non-compliant and do it ourselves. But if I have to deploy something with this, I can create an identity. Remember the identities I mentioned? Well, a managed identity will be a system identity for the policy to log and access the computer if it's needed to install the backup agent that I use as an example. We can go here, non-compliance message. This resource is out of the US geographic boundaries. There. Whenever there is a warning or whenever we have a scope, this will trigger it. Let's go and create. And as easy as that, we have a new policy. It's going to take 10 minutes to be completely deployed. It's already there. You can see assign. I can go to the overview now, and you will see here the policy is not started. Once started, if I try to create out of the United States or the services I already have are out of the United States, I'll start getting details. The same applies here for an initiative. I can go here to definitions, create a new initiative if I need to, or assignment and assign a new initiative. The only difference is that I will have to configure the attributes of each policy inside of the initiative 1, 2, 50, 100. This is how we create a standard baseline of usage for my services, folks. Another characteristic that we have for governance, it's called the resource logs. Myself, personally, love the logs. These are free, included on our service. These are like small ants, really powerful. No one, not even the global admin, can overcome a lock. When you have a lock, you have security. You have two types of locks, read-only and delete locks. As I said, these are created for free. For example, let's go back here to the storage account. Remember, I'm going to go here, open my storage account and say, look for the lock icon. Obviously, it's a white lock. And I can go and say add a lock. This is going to be called, for example, delete protection. You can see here delete protection. This is a demo delete and save. Easy peasy. We have a lock now. Let's check. Overview. I am the global admin. I'm the almighty user of this subscription. There is no one above me as a user. Well, guess what? Cannot be deleted because the resource or the parent is locked. Even better. If I go to the resource group, let me open here my resource group, and I try to delete it, delete the resource group, paste the name, and delete, you can see, even though the lock is on the child object, the parent object is also protected. You cannot delete it like that. I can do it the other way around. I can go to the logs in here. You can see this is data protection on the scope of the series. I can add the delete protection in here. Delete protection. I can call this delete at RG level. Demo at RG level. Resource group, RG. We're there. I'm going to remove this one. This is the one we had, right? So I'm going to remove that one now. There it goes. And keep only the resource group. Let's go back. Let's open the service. Let's go here. Well, there it is. Let's try to delete. In here, and you can see it's inherited too. We can confirm, just for you to see that I'm not lying. We can go to the log, and you can see this is now on the resource group. I cannot even modify it here. It's actually inherited. So this, my friends, is one of the most powerful options to protect. Best practice. If you have a production solution, try to use the delete protection. That way, the users, by accident or by a unintentional activity, or even with a malintention activity, won't be available or won't be allowed to delete something without the permissions. The only way of overcoming a log, my friends, is as an owner or as a global admin to delete the log and then remove the service. As I did, deleting the log and then removing the service without anything being inherited. So those are our locks, okay? As you can see, we have a lot of benefits from locking to protect our services. The next thing we have here, and it's also useful for different purposes, governance, baselines, and also cost management, are the tags. You can add a tag and think about this as a metadata label. You will have, for example, based on division, language, maybe specific attributes. The idea of a tag, folks, is that you can actually provide to the service with the required tools to identify the object without adding any hard code into the object, into the service. That's the use of a tag. You'll have a name and a value. For example, divisions, and you can then create reports based on tags to say, show me the consumption budget of 2020 where the tag equals marketing. You can see the money consumed from the marketing budget in 2020. That's a real example. You can execute a script to report, to clean, to do something like renaming or something based on the tag as a scope. The tag is useful, as I said, for labeling. Okay? But there are also some considerations we have to keep in mind when we talk about the tags. For example, how do we create them? We can create the tags directly from the graphic user interface from the GUI. We can use PowerShell. We can programmatically use, for example, a condition to create it. We can use a script to trigger the creation based on a resource group, a location, the user who created it, etc. We apply this to a resource group, but we don't inherit it like the permissions, like the logs, like the roles. That's an important part. The tag is exclusively attached to the target. We can have different tags between the resource groups and the resources. As a limit, you can have 50 tags with value pairs per resource group, not more than that. As I was mentioning, if you want to create reports based on a consumption, a region, a division, this is how we do it, with a tag. Okay? So as a best practice, my friends, we should start using the tags. In the next modules, when we start creating services, today we have been talking about all the solutions for identities, but when we see all the others that are about to come, you'll see how to assign tags to each of the services. So I promise, and I'll keep my word, that you will see each of the steps on the creation directly on a complete resource. Okay? But now that I mentioned that, we can use the tags for the cost management. On the cost management experience, we have a portal dedicated to control budgets, forecasting, to use tags to report based on specific attributes or scopes that we need. We also have the chance of using recommendations to improve the way we invest or use our money on the subscription. Let me show you here. From the portal, just an FYI, we created this subscription recently for the demonstrations of this session, so we don't have a cost management recommendation yet. But if we scroll down In here, you can see almost to the bottom the cost management. Here you have the scope of the specific service. We can open the subscription, and here you will be able to see from the subscription the cost analysis. What have we spent with? Alerts. We can define alert to say, hey, when you get to this amount of money, trigger a message, send an email based on the scope of my subscription. Okay, you can see it's based on what we have here. I can define budgets and say, hey, for this subscription, we are limit. These notifications we get are because we're using a sponsorship account. That's an important part to mention. If we have a subscription based on pay as you go, free trials, enterprise agreements, or a third party option, we can always come to the cost management to see what we have. And from the recommendations, you can always monitor whatever that seems to be spending money that you're not using. For example, if I create a public IP and I have not allocated that in the last, I don't know, 3 months, I'll get a message saying this IP hasn't been used. And if you dismiss the IP and you delete it, you'll save up to, I don't know, $40 in the year. That's the idea of a recommendation. This can be achieved in any subscription or resource group. Once we go to a resource group in here, for example, I can show you, we open this one, and you also have the chance of a cost analysis. This is not going to show anything because, as I said, it got created recently, but we also have the option in production subscriptions. The whole core of this, my friends, is to plan and control the expenses. Remember, check what you're spending your money on. Check the cost, how it's been built, and if you're actually using it. Use that data to build models and improve the management. Get a report maybe every day, every week to see your consumption. Define budgets. So if you know you have a limit of expenses for a specific project, put a budget limit and put an alert. So whenever you get 85, 80% of the budget, you will receive a notification saying you are reaching your limits. Inform about this. Always report back the information we have. Okay? Take a look on the forecast. At the half of the month, you might know, or you may have an expected amount of money to be at the end of the month. And usually that helps us to control how do we progress. You have the chance, for example, of going into recommendations, as I said. Check what you're not using. Check if one of the tiers is actually spending more money than expected. For example, you might have a pretty large computer that it's supposed to be used for something small. You can dismiss that. Get options to improve and optimize the cost. Okay? And that, my friends, it's our module of governance and service. I hope you enjoyed the session. My name is Arturo Hamilton, and I hope to talk to you on the next session of our workshops. Have a great day and see you the next time.